Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined for a third time by Dr. Azar Gat. He is the Ezer Weizman Professor of National Security at Tel Aviv University in Israel, and today we're going to focus on his latest book, Ideological Fixation From the Stone Age to Today's Culture War. So, Dr. Gat, welcome back to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So tell us first about why you decided to write this book. I mean, why do you think it's relevant today to talk about ideology?
I might start by saying that I started the book before the 2016 American presidential election, before the terms fake news and alternative facts have been introduced into the language. But it was I already felt that the ideological antagonism between the sides in the political and the cultural discourse in all countries were getting sharper and sharper. We seem to be seeing the return of the wars of religion, in the sense that ideologies now function as secular religions. They've been named so very long ago. This is, in the 60s, people tended to talk, theorists tended to talk about the death of ideology, about the ideological camps coming closer together. And there was also, with the same meaning, the notion of the end of history during the 1990s, again, me implying that liberalism, the one ideology, has conquered over all the others. And yet we see that within the liberal camp, not mentioning other ideologies in today's world, but that within the liberal democratic camp, we see such a sharp divide, with the sides thinking the worst of one another and are barely able to communicate at all. So the relevancy has seemed to increase over the period of few years when I began this book.
Right. And tell us then, what is ideology? I know that you usually like to start by approaching topics through an evolutionary perspective, going all the way back to our evolutionary history. So, what would you say are basically the psychological foundations of ideology?
All right. So first let's talk about what ideology is, and what I call ideological fixation is,
Mhm.
and then move to try to understand what the deeper sources of ideology are. So
Okay.
ideology is this has two elements. One is the normative view that one has as to the proper structure and functioning of society and of the relations between among people. So this is a normative, value-laden element that all ideologies have. And the second element that ideologies have is a roadmap as to how to get to the desired aim. So each ideology has a manual for action, interpretation of the world, and action as to how to get to the desired objective. And my book focuses on that second element. That is not on the normative element, because in my view, normative preferences cannot be decided by anything. Ultimately, they are a topic of subjective decision by individuals and collectives, but on the interpretation of the world in terms of facts. In principle, there should not be a connection between what you want and how you understand the world. That's in principle. In reality, people diverge on facts of the world. They dispute each other on that, and this is this is not only because of different interpretation, which might obviously occur on all fields of knowledge, but because of the ideological or value or normative commitment. So I focus on that aspect, why people they reject interpretation of the world that go against their normative preferences and are not able to listen to one another at all.
Mm-hmm. And so that's ideology. What is ideological fixation then?
Ideological fixation is precisely that, adherence to a particular interpretation of the world in terms of facts, in terms of how what the facts of reality are, even when counter-argument might undermine these factual facts, and we see it all the time. People are not able to accept any facts that might come from the other direction. Now, this does not necessarily mean that the truth about reality is somewhere in the middle, or that that people should necessarily agree on them, but there is a complete closure, as the psychologist would term this, a complete closure as to the picture of the world in terms of facts that the other side suggests. The other side might be, only 40% right, 30% right, 20% right, and even if the other side is only 20% right as regards the facts of the world, it still needs adjustment, the incorporation within our worldview. None of this tend to happen.
So let's get now then into the psychological foundations of ideology. Where does it come from exactly?
All right. So the most obvious one was suggested by Marx and by Engels. That is that people, above all, formulate their interpretation of the world in terms of their interests, of their material interests. In American current discourse, this is called where you sit is where you stand. The position that one holds is normally determined by their interest, by their respective position in society. And this is true enough, obviously. But there are other reasons as well. And I'll start with some of the cognitive elements. That is, our picture of the world is very complex. We have a unique ability to construct this simplified models of the world. That is, the world is infinitely complex, and still we are able to construct simplified models that serves us very well in our handling, in coping with the complexities of that world. Now, these models cannot be developed by each individual. They are far too complex to be developed by each individual to himself. So they are the product of social learning. We learn, we are being socialized into a particular worldview, and in this sense, this worldview becomes part of us, becomes part of our culture, which shape our view of the world. And there is also confidence in numbers. If we belong to a large community of that hold a similar belief system and interpretations of the world, this may mean that we are on the right track, everybody says so, or most of the people around us say so. So it must have validity to it. And finally, closure to other perspectives on reality is also a means of a natural means in social bargaining. That is, rival camps vie among themselves regarding the way society should be shaped and so forth. And if in such a conflict, you better not give an inch to the other side. Obviously, sometimes you compromise, but sometimes the most effective means of bargaining is to stick to your guns. And this is what we often see in ideological conflicts.
Mm-hmm. Of course, in the book, you also spend some time talking about or addressing what is truth and how we arrive there, and some challenges to, for example, what scientists determine as true, like the postmodernist challenge. So let's get a little bit into that. How do we determine what is true?
Right. So first of all, we must realize, and I think the whole course of philosophy leads us to this from ancient times to the present, that our structure of knowledge is based on some assumptions. Assumptions that look the most reasonable given everything that we know. For example, we assume that reality outside us exists. This cannot be proven. Okay, we might be experiencing a dream. So we have to assume, we don't have to. We assume that reality exists. It's the most reasonable point of view as we see it. It's the most practical one. So we assume this, and we add assumptions in a so-called hierarchy of facts that constitute our, the structure of knowledge. So obviously each part of this is subject to alteration. If we find out that parts of what we believe to be true is not so. If we once we accept that it to a large part rests on assumptions that we regard as most reasonable, we understand that there is no perception whatsoever that can be proved to be wrong in any strict sense of the word. That is, if people believe that Elvis is still alive, or that the earth is flat. There is no way to prove otherwise unless we share some assumption about the world. Having said that, that's one point. Another point is that what we regard as true is never complete. That is, we tend to conceptualize parts of reality, and each such concept can be further elaborated. I'll give a historical example from things that I've worked on. So, for example, when French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau was asked after World War I, who was to blame for World War I, or what do you think? No, this was actually Lloyd George, Prime Minister of Britain. What do you think in the following generation would say about the causes? What caused World War I? He said that they would not say that Belgium invaded Germany. Okay, so we understand that if we accept a certain concept such as Belgium, Germany, war, and so on, it was not the case that Belgium invaded Germany, but the other way around. But still, this is not a complete presentation, and there can never be one. For example, we can say that in the decade before the war, the Britain and France had large empires, and that Germany thought it was unjust that they should have their empires, and Germany, while Germany was denied an empire. This would alter the picture somewhat, and we can add more and more elements into our simplified model for explaining why World War I erupted. Okay, so in this sense, all facts are partial, which does not mean a so-called postmodernist argument made the thing. I mean, they never argued it, but they gave the feeling that for example, that there is no such thing as a mistake. For example, it's a mistake to argue that the United States, or for that matter, that Belgium invaded Germany. Given the concept we know, given what we understand by this concept, it's clear that Belgium did not invade Germany, or that you do not live in Israel while I live in Portugal. So these facts are wrong once we accept certain trivialities, which does not mean that true concepts are not subject to various perspectives, given more complex or more elaborated model of reality.
Right. But do you think that when it comes to the criticisms put forth by the postmodernists against, I don't know if directly against science, but at least against some of its assumptions, or at least when they say that we also have to look, when considering how scientific knowledge is produced, we also have to look at the social, cultural context and other things like that, that might have a kernel of truth to it?
Absolutely. Only the postmodernist argument has been, overstretched. Facts are to some degree relative, to some degree are construed by our means of comprehension. They are influenced by our particular perspective, which in turn is influenced by many things, including our interest and place in society. However, the postmodernist rhetoric, they never claimed it, suggested that there is no such thing as truth. And this is, or that all truth is constructed. Yes, it is constructed, but not only constructed. There is an interface between our means of cognition and reality is still there, and there is a reality check. If you want to, to give another example, let's take Michel Foucault, one of the leading of postmodernism. He termed forget the name, the disease from which the AIDS. He termed AIDS, a social plot to social construct intended to vilify homosexuals. He denied that this was an illness. It didn't prevent him dying from this disease. The fact that you terms things social construct does not stop things from happening.
Right. And talking now about religion, where does the intellectual conflict between science and religion stem from exactly?
So religion is a very complex and interesting phenomenon, It has several elements joining together, and of course there is no necessary conflict between religious and science, and various religious systems in the East and in other places are very modest in their claim in terms of dogma and so forth. So the conflict between religious and science mostly belongs to the monotheistic religions of Western Eurasia, and more particularly when Christianity, the Catholic Church, was apprehensive that the discoveries of the new science undermine its traditional interpretation of the world, and as described by the scriptures. I mean, I deal with religion as pre-modern ideology. All pre-modern ideologies were almost exclusively religious. They, as I said, they include various elements. One of them is magic. That is the belief that some ritual can perform an effect in the world. Some of them were the belief in supernatural entities of this or other source. It's interesting to talk about the evolutionary roots of this in people's tendency to view agency behind phenomena. That is, they view faces on the moon and so forth because agencies in the shape of humans and animals tended to be our greatest risks in our aboriginal past. So we had this inclination to see them even when they did not exist. Better safe than sorry. So there is this tendency to believe in supernatural agencies that lurk behind the phenomena, but they are also system of virtue. That is, the religions prescribe a code of behavior which would best serve people's relations with the environment, with other people, and so forth. And these elements come together in various ways in the various religions, and dogmatism in terms of facts or doctrines are, more stronger with some religions and less strong with others.
Mm-hmm. Do you agree when some people claim that the conflict between science and religion stems from the fact that science deals with facts and religion deals with values and beliefs?
It depends on the nature of your religious faith. If your religious faith include factual claims about the world, so yes, they might come in conflict with science. If your religious faith is indeed, and with most people this is not the case, but if your belief system, especially not in the monotheistic religion, if your religious belief is more a more code of behavior, is more reflect a spiritual orientation towards the world, towards other people, so then yes, it should not necessarily be in conflict with science. In reality, it often was and sometimes still is, as we see, for the example, in the current debate in the United States regarding creationism and the evolution and so forth. In most parts of Europe, the conflict is much less severe. Religion as a human phenomenon has itself evolved, and historically, culturally, and has in many ways adapted itself to the picture presented by modern science.
So you also talk in the book about how during the 19th and the 20th century, some secular religions arise, like, for example, liberalism, socialism, and fascism. We can get into each one of them in time, but before that, what, generally speaking, characterizes secular ideologies, and in what ways do they differ from, for example, religious ideologies?
All right. So we are talking about ideologies that emerged during modernity. And modernity here is above all marked obviously the Enlightenment is a landmark, but above all marked by the emergence of industrial societies and the huge transformation in the human way of life that industrialization brought about. Now, the three system of thought, the three ideologies that emerged, as you mentioned, liberalism, socialism, all of them, and what we called fascism. That's a very generic term, but all of them have various currents within them. All of them came as try to provide a menu or blueprint as to how these new industrial societies, with the huge wealth that it created and the new problems and miseries that it also brought about, how it should be organized in order to increase human happiness, basically. And all three differed sharply among them as to what the right blueprint for the organization of this new industrial and urban society should be. And all of them presented a factual picture of the world, each of them that conflicted with that of the other. And, we mentioned this mainly with respect to Marxism. That is its interpretation of the world, at once very sophisticated, but also hugely dogmatic. In time, as events unfolded, turned out to be more and more dogmatic, more and more oblivious to the realities that the attempts to implement socially or Marxism, communism encountered, to the extent that, in the words of one novelist, they argued about the existence of darkness at noon. That is, things that were entirely in conflict with evident reality. Marxists and Marxist theorists, both in the communist the bloc, but also in the West, completely ignored or explained away the inconvenient parts of reality as to the attempt to implement socialism in the socialist countries. Mm-hmm. So this was again a case of ideological fixation, and it's it's for a good reason that these ideologies have been described as secular religions.
Right, and I mean, getting into each of them specifically. What characterizes liberalism? What are its main values or ideas?
So liberalism has several elements. You have political liberalism, which promotes individualism, which promotes human rights, as they are referred to, the right of free speech, the right of association, increasingly representation of the popular sovereignty, representation as a means of government, which eventually, by around 1900, also espoused the democracy, which was not part of liberalism because it was afraid of the masses that might abolish human rights. And then there you have economic liberalism. That is free enterprise, the wisdom of the markets, and so forth. So this is liberalism in its classical form, as formulated in the 19th century and in the 18th century and in the 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, there was a kind of a split that has deepened ever since between left liberalism and right liberalism, where right liberalism continued to emphasize individual liberty and free enterprise, whereas left liberalism, becoming more conscious of the huge gaps created within modern society, thought to ameliorate them and give people more opportunity by investing in education, in welfare system, and so forth. And so what we now term in, say, in the United States as progressivism and conservatism are in some ways the two streams into which classical liberalism has developed.
Mm-hmm. And what about socialism? Earlier you talked a little bit about Marxism and communism. So where do you place socialism in relation to that and to the other ideologies we're talking about?
So socialism obviously has many currents, throughout what mainly characterized all the socialist currents was that they rejected the view of free enterprise as the optimal tool for increasing well-being across society, and as an alternative suggested that communal ownership of the means of production rather than private property would be much more effective both in generating wealth and in securing the just distribution of that wealth. Now there have been, as I said, many currents. Marxism is only one of them. Some of the socialist currents were democratic, believe that the goals can be achieved through the elections and the parliamentary system, and such socialist parties came to power in Western Europe during the first half of the 20th century. You had the non-democratic the currents of socialism, including above all Marxism and then the regimes that they regarded Marx as their prophet.
Mm-hmm. So, and finally, fascism. Where and how did this ideology arise, and what are its main tenets?
So fascism arose last among these three major ideologies from around 1900, And it emerged as a reaction against both liberalism, which it saw as atomizing and alienating, putting people against one another and isolated in their individuality on the one hand, and against socialism and communism on the other hand, which they saw as oppressive and leveling. What fascist movement, and again, we use the term in a very generic way, fascism movement thought to rekindle the sense of community, the sense of the collective, by subsuming the individual within a living community, mostly the people, the nation, and thereby avoiding the divisive elements of capitalism, reviving the sense of collective belonging, of the warm feelings of brotherhood within the community that they sense was lost in liberalism, transcending the triviality of liberal society as they saw it, by promoting more elevated collective values. Obviously, there were various streams again to fascism, largely influenced by the particular conditions of the countries in which these movements took root.
Mm-hmm. And why do you focus on these three contemporary ideologies? Do you think, for example, that they are the ones that play the biggest role in current ideological conflict across the world, or?
So more than current ideologies, these were the classical ideologies of the 19th and 20th century. So in a way, I describe them more as more than past phenomenon than as a current phenomena, because even though we might see some revival of themes taken from these classical ideologies in today's debate, or in some of the emerging powers of today, say China and Russia and so forth. So they belong to the 19th and 20th century mainly, and as I say, it's not accidental. It comes from the attempt to understand and shape the new condition created by industrial society into a blueprint of not only of in some ways of salvation. These ideologies had this aspect of the secular religions also promised salvation to people, a deeper answer to the distresses of human existence. This is particularly noticeable within Marxism and also with fascism.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to ask you also about some sort of conflict that tends to exist ideologically between, quote unquote, the West and the rest. So there are people on the one hand that say that the West is the best civilization or culture ever and it's the superior culture, and then there are other people that pit it against the rest and say that the West has been the cause of many problems across the world. So where does this conflict, let's say, stem from, really?
So this is very interesting. Classical liberalism during the 18th and 19th century was quite confident that it brought the blessings of enlightenment and and all the other blessings of modernity that were far superior to anything that existed in pre-modern societies. But there's been a change since, say, the middle of the 20th century, when the so-called, especially the so-called New Left, people who were disappointed with Marxism, but which retained the Marxist negative view of capitalist society, when these views became more and more fashionable in the West and have become part and parcel of liberalism, which joined hand with liberalism, or at least became quite prominent within several currents within liberalism. Postmodernism continued the trend. So it has become commonplace in today's world that the West was the source of the problems, not only in all other parts of the world, that it committed the crimes that survive to this day, that it disrupted the innocent and blissful existence of native societies across the world, and so forth. And this claim, I suggest, these are all factual claims. I'm not talking, these are all factual claims, I suggest misplaced. Pre-modern society was rife with bloody wars, with ruthless social oppression, with enslavement. This was the picture across the world. In this sense, Western imperialism was much more benign than any form of imperialism in any other place. If we take, for example, India, as I said, was the source of ruthless social suppression. It had a series of empires, replacing one another over the centuries. If we take Africa, the same as I just mentioned, ruthless social suppression, endless wars. There has been during the 20th century the misleading Rousseauite view that after Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that Aboriginal societies were, they lived in kind of blissful innocence. The opposite is true. So when decolonization came from about the middle of the 20th century, and the demand for independence and self-determination came, it was an expression of values taken from the West, from liberalism on pages, and the retreat of colonialism was in itself, an expression of a liberal recognition that you needed the consent of the ruled in order to rule, and when this consent was not there, ultimately the colonial powers, the Western colonial powers, pulled out. We are, simplifying things here because of limits of time and so forth. So, one could add that, for example, in India, British rule brought not only unity, which never existed in this place in India, but also an honest system of administration, of justice, which modern India inherited from the British Raj, and which never existed there. The British rule and French rule abolished slavery throughout Africa. The only countries where slavery continued until the 1960s, such as Oman and Saudi Arabia, were the countries that were not subject to Western colonial rule. So what we see here is a very different picture of the pre-modern world, that was very far from the aboriginal world of innocence that we hear in the critique of Western influence.
Mm-hmm. But do you think that, for example, when it comes to the cultural aspects of the West, that it makes sense to talk about it as a monolithic culture or civilization? Because, I mean, for example, when looking across history, there seems to be, particularly in the intellectual realm, many different disagreements and many different positions, philosophical, scientific, and so on, religious even. So does it make sense to think about the West as one single monolithic thing?
So when we talk about the West these days, we mean Western liberalism.
Okay.
And liberal values. Now, obviously, there are differences, and there is there is a delicate line here that you need. It's ideally you would want to respect values in other parts of the world, which is according to the liberal worldview, is something desirable. And at the same time, we need to remember what, in many cases, these values might be. I'll just, as an illustration, tell the story about the British viceroy in India during the 19th century. His name was Napier, William Napier, and when he forbade the burning of widows, which was the Hindu custom throughout India after the death of the husband, and they forbade it throughout India. And when the Hindu priests came to him and said to him, "This is our custom, this is our culture," so he said, "Well, our culture is to hang everybody who would dare burn widows any longer." And the custom of burning widows gradually died out in India. So people should ask themselves, and there is, as I said, a delicate line here, what is one's view with respect to such hard cases, where toleration might mean an offense against one's own value. And there is no conclusive answer in the structure of the cosmos to any such value questions. But still, since this is mostly a liberal critique of liberal imperialism, also obviously not only liberal, but comes from other parts of the world, from the Muslim world, from East Asia and so forth. So there is a fine line here, and one should decide what, in one's view, the dividing line should be between toleration and acceptance of customs that are regarded by some as abhorrent. There is no silver bullet here. Everybody should make his own or her own view with respect to this.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think are some of the biggest current debates in modern liberal democracies? What are some of the ideologies that are more vocal nowadays?
So I give three examples in my treatment of current affairs. One is, again, the dispute regarding the role of the West in the world and the role of the United States in the world. This is one, the West versus the rest. And I also deal with two other questions. One of them is the concept of the nation, which so-called modernists in the study of nationalism regarded the national phenomenon as something contrived, something superficial, something that has no real foundation in the human psyche. I'm not talking about whether or not it's legitimate, but whether or not it's reality or just something that has been created or manipulated by state authorities during the 20th century or the 19th century. And I argue, and I wrote a book about this, and you even interviewed me on that book some time ago. So I argued that the phenomenon of belonging to a community, which during state times is known as national, but before that was known as tribalism, is an intrinsic element of human nature. And that once this is realized, then how nationalism should be handled becomes there might be new light shed on the question, whatever your normative conclusion might be. So the idea that it can simply be written off obviously affects the debate about what the boundaries of nationalism, national identity, national solidarity should be. Again, they do not preclude conflicting normative conclusions, but recognizing that nationalism, nations, tribalism are all the predispositions, their propensities that are proclivities that have deep roots in human nature is essential and is denied by large parts of or dismissed by large parts of the public opinion in today's debates about immigration, about other things.
Mm-hmm. And what are the so-called culture wars? What does that term refer to exactly?
So we know that in the West today, especially in the United States, we have two camps which are not on speaking terms with one another, that view each other in the darkest of terms, that in the United States, had it been feasible, it's not inconceivable that they would have separated and created two separate states, had they not been too mixed together to make this viable. In any respect, what we have today is a kind of cold civil war in the United States between these two camps, which are not which are deaf to each other's arguments and claims about reality. This is what is known as culture wars.
And how do you look at the relationship between the intellectuals and ideology and ideological fixation? I mean, I'm asking you that also because it seems to me that most of, the main sources of many of these ideologies we've been talking about, and also some current ones in the political realm and elsewhere, are intellectuals.
Right? Yes. So what we have here is a kind of paradox. On the one hand, we would expect intellectuals that are supposed to be very critical, including of their own assumptions, to be skeptical, to be open to conflicting considerations and perspective. We expect them to be relatively free from the biases. And indeed, this is their self-perceptions of themselves. They regard themselves as such. On the other hand, however, what we see throughout the history of ideology is that intellectual whose profession is the study and development of ideas, figure prominently in some of the most grotesque, even disturbing ideological misconception and biases. And in a way, you might say that that ideological fixation is the professional hazard of intellectuals. So you have them, you have intellectuals addicted entirely to, for example, to the spell of Marxism at the time, closing their eyes to the appalling crimes carried out by the Soviet Union at the time, and to the appalling conditions of life in the Soviet Union, in other communist countries, later in China, in Mao's China, where Western intellectuals were, very supportive, identify themselves with the regimes in these countries, from Sartre to Chomsky and so forth. The number is so huge. I mean, the phenomenon is so extensive. It's so it was George Orwell, the sharp critic of all these dogmas, who said only intellectuals would believe such nonsense. No ordinary man would. So I'm making this point as a reminder, as a point for other intellectuals still, in my view, addicted to all to various systems of salvation with very little skepticism or spirit of self-criticism. I point this out, as food for thought.
Mm-hmm. Right. So we've been talking about ideology and ideologies. I would like to ask you, is it bad to have an ideology? I'm asking you that because nowadays, when it comes to the current debates we talked about, many times people bring to the table the ideologue as a pejorative, and they say that, or they claim that having an ideology is something bad, intellectually, morally, whatever. But I mean, with the caveat, of course, that if you look carefully into what they're saying, they're usually criticizing people who have ideologies that they don't favor, and they don't really do the same when it comes to their own ideology. But just generally speaking, can we really say that ideologies are bad?
No, I wouldn't say so. And your question is very, very important. So first of all, ideologies are inseparable from our perception and conception of the world, which involves, interpreting the world and finding our way and trying to construct society in a way that would increase whatever value we believe in. So these are inseparable part of the human psyche, and their significance is obvious in terms of the practical consequences. At the same time, we must try, in my view, to guard against that's the pejorative aspect of the world ideologue that you mentioned. That is that it can bring dogmatism. It can bring dogmatism with respect to the interpretation of the world. It can bring dogmatism as to the practical effects that applying this or that aspect of the ideology would have on the world. Once while ideology is inseparable part of the human psyche, what I call for is less dogmatism, more openness to arguments, more openness to the constraints imposed by reality, this is what I call for.
So I have two more questions. So when it comes to trying to understand and deal with the most pernicious aspects of ideological thinking, do you think that, what do you think is the best approach here? Do you think that it's good to try to understand it at an individual level and say that, for example, some people are simply stupid or something like that, or they have some sort of defect, let's say, in their psychology that makes them more prone to some sort of ideology? Or do you think it's better to try to understand it at a more collective level and looking more into factors like political, economic, cultural, ecological factors and others?
Obviously, both. Perhaps some people are by nature psychologically more inclined towards dogmatism. There are, psychological studies of this effect, and they seem to suggest that this is the case. They also seem to suggest that some people are biologically inclined toward that or the other, toward that ideological direction or a different one. They are by nature more conservative or more progressive, and this is, makes sense, and it's probably the case. It's also true that the particular historical conditions of each society might not only shape ideological perspectives, but also the level of dogmatism and so forth. So both elements are there. What I'd like to point out, and I think that in a way I said it with respect to intellectuals, intellectual fixation is in many cases is demonstrated by the best and the brightest, as it were. That is, they are not stupid. They are many times very intelligent, very articulate. We shall not go over the list of great ideologists and intellectuals who espouse this or that ideologies, very famous names of all ideologies. So obviously they are characteristically adherents of ideology are very smart people. Many of them, however, lack skepticism, self-criticism with respect to they are addicted. They find themselves addicted to these ideological intellectual creeds. It's in reference to this that it has been said that soundness is more important than brilliance. So it's not stupidity; it's other factors. Some of them character traits, some of them a product of their times.
Right. So my final question will be then, of course, you've already touched a little bit on this in my previous question, but is there anything that can be done to fight back against the current culture wars and political division that we see in society across the globe, but in this case, particularly in the West?
So I have no illusions that that things. Obviously, things might. Ideological division is sometimes more profound, sometimes less profound. It's the various historical and cultural factors affect now the social media has vastly accentuated the ideological polarization because people are locked within their social groups, read only what people, like-minded people, put on the web, and support each other in their conviction, in their prejudices, in their dogmas, and so forth. So obviously, changing condition might change it, but as my final chapter of the conclusion is titled "Ideological Fixation Now and Ever." It's an inherent part, whether or not it can be mitigated. Obviously, it can. Sometimes it's less sharp. Sometimes it's more so. My book is a very modest attempt to speak to those who are able to recognize the phenomenon and perhaps, on the margins, speak to these people.
Great. So the book is again Ideological Fixation from the Stone Age to today's culture wars. I will be leaving a link to it in the description box of this interview. And Dr. Gat, thank you again for taking the time to come on the show. And it's always a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you very much.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing and to keep the channel sustainable, please consider supporting me on Patreon or PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of this interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Einlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check the website at einlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett Perga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Ian Ricalania, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Wo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger, Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windager, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Enguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernardini, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Ivan Bodren, Paul Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Haslem Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T., Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W. João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dajla Araújo, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Antonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litzke, Dennis Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Todd Shackelford, Sonny Smith, and John Weizman. My producers Ezer Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Luis Caetano, Tom Wagner, Dan Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus Francis, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Elder, and my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.